Sweden, with its COVID-19 voluntary guidance strategy, thought that they got it right.
But their strategy ignored the needs of the vulnerable and the elderly.
The American Religious Town Hall meeting is now in session.
Welcome, friends, to the American Religious Town Hall meeting, where the discussion of religious, political, and social issues is meant to promote the cause of religious freedom and to help us better understand each other. And now, here's your host and moderator, Pastor Jerry Lutz.
Welcome to the American Religious Town Hall meeting. We are here in the coronavirus pandemic time, so as a result, you'll see that I'm James Weingartner and not Pastor Lutz. And our panelists are diminished to give us more space in the room. We are few and far between here, but we're still happy to be here to discuss in American fashion our ideas and differences and our similarities. So, before we begin, let's introduce our panelists.
I'm Bishop Michael Olson, and I am the Roman Catholic Bishop of the Diocese of Fort Worth, Texas.
I'm Rabbi Dan Levin. I'm the Senior Rabbi at Temple Bethel in Boca Raton, Florida.
And I'm Tom Plumley. I'm the Senior Minister at First Christian Church in Fort Worth, Texas, a part of the Christian Church Disciples of Christ.
My name is Canon John Peterson. I am a priest in the Episcopal Church, and I'm canonically resident in the Diocese of Washington, D.C.
We'd like to thank our panelists for being here. We have a wonderful subject to discuss today about the pandemic and the COVID-19. Sweden has taken a very different approach to the coronavirus pandemic than its Scandinavian neighbors, Denmark, Finland, and Norway, as well as the rest of Europe. Canada and the United States, much of Europe, Canada, the majority of states in the United States have imposed many restrictions on public life to stem the spread of the coronavirus. Sweden did not. It did not go into lockdown or impose any social distancing policies. Although the Swedish government ultimately banned gatherings of 50 or more people in one place and visits to elderly care homes, the ban excluded places like schools, restaurants, and gyms. On the face of it, little has shut down in Sweden. However, the vast majority of the population has taken to voluntary social distancing, which is the crux of Sweden's strategy to slow the virus. It is also to be remembered that the Swedish laws are mostly based on voluntary measures or individual responsibility. Legally, Sweden cannot lock down a geographical area as a result of this relatively relaxed strategy. Sweden has had the highest number of deaths. Currently, as we sit here today, 4,784 compared to its Nordic neighbors, Norway, who's had 242, and Denmark, 597, and Finland, 326. Today, I'd like our panelists to discuss the Swedish strategy. Questions include, number one, because of the high death rate in Sweden, has the relaxed voluntary guidance strategy really worked? Two, with our love of liberty, freedom, and some of us not liking the federal government telling us what to do, should the United States have adopted the Swedish model? And three, what national government, in your opinion, has handled this pandemic in the most responsible way? Now we turn to our panelists, and we begin with Canon Peterson.
Thank you so much. In total transparency, I have to confess that all my ancestry is Swedish. I am sure that all of us who have been following the pandemic and the many news reports over the last few weeks, that one of the discussion points has always been the Swedish experiment dealing with the COVID-19 and the pandemic. Nearly every single country in the world today has confirmed cases of COVID-19 within its borders, but few have received the type of scrutiny that Sweden has received. And this is because Sweden has a uniquely relaxed position and response to the virus, with no strict lockdowns, and proved to be such a departure from its own Nordic neighbors, but also a much more different perspective than the rest of the world. The theory behind Sweden's decision was not to have a shutdown or a shutdown because that would shatter the economy. Instead, no quarantine in place and shelter in place orders, although many people in Sweden have followed that rule. Sweden instead issued very light suggestions, banning gatherings of 50 people or more, and certainly trying to keep a social distancing the best that they can. What is behind this whole understanding of what Sweden has done is basically to have a herd immunity. A herd immunity means that when enough people in the population have become immune to the virus, the risk of the virus is much lowered across the board. And consequently, at the price that they have paid for that, is this tremendously high death rate. In other words, the idea that Sweden kept its bars and restaurants open, more people among the less vulnerable, as Michael has already said, would prove an immunity and ultimately would slow the virus. That did not happen.
Bishop Olson.
Well, excuse me, I too am Swedish in background, and my ancestors were thrown out of 6 other European countries, and that's how we all got here. But the importance of herd immunity is a very good principle. However, the key thing with the COVID-19 was that the need to flatten a curve and to avoid a rush on our hospitals. And I think Sweden, which is really not a libertarian state, quite the opposite. It has a very strong socialist understanding and a very strong group identity. And I think it's in their tradition to try to do a voluntary sense of responsibility. I think their goals, though, had in mind as well that in keeping the economy going, they wanted to keep those who would be able to produce for the economy going stronger, and whose catching this virus wouldn't be as at a high risk of death as those with comorbidities like the elderly and the chronically ill, those who are, in a sense, reliant on government assistance and charity of others. And I think that was very much at the heart of their understanding of their approach, in the sense they didn't want to, in a sense, destroy their economy and the social fabric of their society because of those who are more vulnerable to catch it. And I think that's one approach to this, but it's not that different, in a sense, I think, to some of the values that we've heard espoused by some of our politicians and leaders, where a sense of is like, well, we all have to go sometime. And, well, you know, it's important that we not tank the economy because, you know, at the expense of those who are near death anyway and are high in comorbidities. And I think the responsibility is that steps are needed to mitigate the spread of the virus, and especially to be mindful that before we start invoking our rights, we also stop and think about what our responsibilities are and how we measure those responsibilities in the care for others, particularly with the vulnerable, but not stopping there. I think also the Swedish approach had with it a sense of they didn't take other steps to mitigate the spread. So, for example, they were late with regard to provisions of sanitizers and the use of masks and social distancing. And even in their nursing homes and their assisted living centers, those protocols were not maintained. And that's why they're finding the higher death rate today. And they're getting some outrage from the family members who've survived, those who've died from this disease.
Thank you, Bishop. Rabbi Levin?
So in Jewish tradition, freedom is of, I think, in many cases, supreme value. The celebration of Passover is the celebration of freedom. The core of our narrative is the Exodus, the liberation from oppression. And so we can't pretend that the loss of freedom is a small thing. It's a big thing. And we also can't pretend that the economic impact of what it means to shut down a country is a small thing either. There are more than 40 million unemployed people in the United States. Businesses have become shuttered. You have all kinds of economic uncertainty, people who have job loss, economic catastrophe. We can't pretend that that is of no consequence. It's not a binary. But at the same time, I think that one of the things that our tradition teaches is that freedom is something that needs to be tempered if you're going to be part of a society. So my friend Rabbi Gordon Tucker taught this amazing idea that when the Israelites were born into freedom from passing through that wall of water in the parting of the Red Sea, they were like little children, almost like adolescents. They thought they could do anything. They thought there were no limits. They thought there were no boundaries until they arrive at Mount Sinai. And at Mount Sinai, the Holy One says, time to grow up. And what does it mean to grow up? Growing up means, yeah, you have to limit your freedom. You can't be with any God. You have to be exclusively with one God. You can't be with any number of people. You have to pick one partner. You have to not be able to do everything. You have to limit yourself by law to make sure that you don't murder, you don't steal, you don't harm another, that you perform what you need to do to care for the social weal. And by accepting those limits on yourself, that's how you realize spiritual maturity. And I think that when you look at countries that I think have done really effective jobs, like New Zealand, where they came together as one country, everybody collaborating with each other, and they said, we are going to collectively shut this down. They have realized no virus in their country now and are ready as a country to open up and realize the economic benefit of having come together. I think it's when we were all apart from each other that we realized, I think, how difficult it is not just for human safety, but also for economic safety as well.
Thank you, Rabbi. Reverend Plumley?
Thank you. Rabbi, I think there are some of us who have passed through the waters of baptism who have come out on the other side thinking the same thing, that we can do whatever we want to. and that sense needs to be tempered. I think that one of the things that two issues. One is we've forgotten in our desire for freedom that more of us are vulnerable than we think. We have named certain sets of workers essential, and those have tended to be. We think of first responders and healthcare workers and so forth, but those have also tended to be people who work in the food industry, people who either are involved in the production, the processing, the storage, the selling of food, and so forth, which tend to be people of color and tend to be people that are on the lower end of the economic spectrum. And those are not people who are expendable. And I think that what you mentioned about New Zealand goes for Vietnam as well. Vietnam is a country of 96 million people. They've had 0 coronavirus deaths. 0. At least at the time of this taping of this program.
What they're telling us.
Pardon?
And what they're telling us.
And what they're telling us, sure. The economic argument cuts both ways. The shutdowns can prove if they are effective at stopping the virus, can prove to be an economic boon, as New Zealand has discovered, that you come out on the other side in a much better position economically than those who are continuing to have to fight the thing.
Canon Peterson?
I want to go back to something that Rabbi Levin said. I think the whole understanding of what it means to live in community is so important, and how you stress that, and how we as a nation, as a community, respond. And that New Zealand was able to indeed, as a nation, be a community in this type of a context, with its minority communities as well. I mean, they certainly have a very strong minority community, but how they have survived. And I think that your point here, particularly the Mount Sinai experience, I think that is really a critical point that I would want to underline in relationship to just how we relate and how we feel community. The other important statistic here coming out of Sweden is that instead of helping the economy, it has had exactly the opposite effect. Sweden's decisions that they made have had absolutely the opposite effect. The unemployment, for example, in Sweden was at 7.2, but as a result of the pandemic, that is now up to 10.1%. So that hasn't even been reversed by having this relaxed program that Sweden has. But your point, I would thoroughly agree with. It's how you understand yourself as a community, how you understand yourself as a nation in relationship to how one responds.
Well, Reverend Plumlee, go ahead.
Excuse me, yeah, but it's also, do we need government? You know, there are many folks who simply believe that we don't need government. There are times we don't need government to interfere in our lives, but I think we're seeing that there are times that we do need government to be making decisions and helping and disseminating information and helping us to understand how we can, because we are community, get through something like this in a better, healthier, stronger way.
I think also these decisions deal with real health of real people. I mean, and so they're very practical decisions that have to be made. I mean, New Zealand, you know, also lacks the density of population that some of the places like New York City who've been so hard hit by this, and other areas like in Italy. They also their economy is structured differently than many of the other areas, and so it's very easy to maintain closure from or a social or physical distancing from other nations. I think Sweden, the argument about unemployment, et cetera, it's an interdependent nation with the European Union, and so it's hard to measure that, because how many of those jobs that have been lost are also contingent on the economies of the other nations as well. And I think that's true. You know, I mean, business involves other people by definition, and it involves travel, it involves communication and a shared goal.
Thank you, Bishop Olson. Rabbi Levin?
I think, you know, we don't choose a pandemic, but we get to choose how we want to respond. And I think that nobody wants this kind of intrusion on their life. But ultimately, I think when we need to figure out how we confront the awful, we confront the awful by pulling together, by recognizing, by naming it, by saying this is what there is, and this is how we have to confront it, and this is how collectively we need to figure out how we take care of each other. I think that one of the things that has struck me about how we've dealt with the pandemic is that we have not had the same cause as I think we need collectively as a nation to say we need to share in the burden of this sacrifice. We need to look out after each other. And when we pull together and share that sacrifice, we will be able to come out on the other side. I think sometimes we're not always as honest with each other as we need to be, and that leads to our peril and our doom.
Very good. We thank each of our panelists, and it seems to me that Rabbi Levin has really capped it by telling us that we have a balance in our faith between restraint and freedom, the freedom of restraint and the restraint of freedom. And that, writ large, is the question that we have to face as a political government, and that's what we're struggling with right now. While we're struggling with that, let's go to a message from our sponsor.
We hope you are enjoying today's program. If you would like to learn more about the American Religious Town Hall, please visit our website at americanreligious.org. That's americanreligious.org. There you can read about the mission and history of the program, learn about the Town Hall estates, and view past programs by clicking the appropriate menu buttons. Each week, Pastor Lutz looks forward to receiving your letters. You may write to him at the address shown on your screen. Send your letters to Pastor Jerry Lutz, American Religious Town Hall Meeting, P.O. Box 180118, Dallas, Texas 75218. That's Pastor Jerry Lutz, American Religious Town Hall Meeting, P.O. Box 180118, Dallas, Texas 75218. Thank you for writing, and thank you for watching.
Thank you. Welcome back. It's time for our summary statements, and we'll start with Bishop Olson.
A national strategy, like any strategy involving public health, requires the listening and commitment to priorities. And it's best that those priorities, as they're established, are set by conversations of those who will be affected by them, both as a whole and also in particular communities. I think it's in our best interest that as we exercise liberty with responsibility and care, that we are especially mindful of those who would otherwise go without a voice and who we might overlook because of their vulnerabilities. People like the elderly, people like the chronically ill, and people who are disenfranchised because of poverty or racial prejudice.
Reverend Plumley.
Thank you. One of the questions that you asked us in the original moderator statement, Mr. Moderator, was the question about how did nations act most responsibly, and which nations acted most responsibly, and there were different degrees to which different nations locked down or shut down or imposed mandatory stay-at-home orders or shut down schools and so forth. There are different degrees by which they did that, but I think clearly the single most important thing that happened in the most responsible countries were those that acted early. And regardless of what they did, it was the early action, the refusal to put on blinders and think that it was going to go away, but to act, that was the critical thing.
Thank you, Reverend. Canon Peterson?
Yes. I certainly want to underline what Tom was just speaking about at the end, because the other three Scandinavian nations acted early. And their death rates, for example, in Norway, you only have 4.5 deaths per 100,000. Finland, 5.9 deaths per 100,000. In contrast to Sweden at 46.25 deaths per 100,000. So certainly acting early had a very important impact on those other three Scandinavian countries and the lower rates that they had. I also would like to go back to something that Michael had said, that the impact of Europe and Sweden's relationship to Europe is also a very important factor here. And Sweden actually thought by their program that they would be able to beat the odds in relationship to Europe. And that, of course, has been proven false as well. And that their whole economy is going to be, is in bad a shape as Europe's after this phenomenon is over.
Thank you, Canon. Rabbi?
So this debate, this figuring out how we balance freedom and public health, I think has elucidated a lot of interesting things for all of us in our world. One of the things that we've learned is that we are all interdependent on each other. We live in a global community, and we can't pretend that the actions of one nation don't bear on the lives of everybody else in the rest of the world. And so we need to figure out how we can collaborate better beyond national borders so that we can take care of all the different kinds of vulnerable people, not just in our own country, but around the world as well. The second thing that we learn is that freedom oftentimes is about thinking about me and about what's happening to me. But in the book of Numbers, Moses is described as the most humble person who ever lived, and his life was not about himself, it was about thinking about others. And if we can cultivate enough humility to realize that there are others whose lives matter, others who know things that we ought to know, others who have expertise that perhaps we can draw on, and others whose lives we have to care about, even if it doesn't bear on our own unique individual wants, then we will build a stronger, more secure moral fabric in the world.
Thank you, Rabbi Levin. Such an important subject we're addressing here is the question of individual versus group rights, and really individual freedom versus individual responsibility. And that is exactly what our nation has tried for 200 plus years to thread the needle, so to speak, to get right into the middle. And it brings us to the charter of the American Religious Town Hall, which provides that Roman Catholics, Protestants, Jews, educators, and others may appear on this program and can declare their beliefs without hesitance. And the rest of the members of the panel will uphold and guarantee that American right to all who will appear, irrespective of race or creed, so that the rest of the world can see that here in America, we believe in civil and religious freedom, not only in theory, but in reality. Now, friends, until next week, at the same time and over the same channel, the American Religious Town Hall meeting stands adjourned. May the God of all of us bless all of you.